Hey everyone, today I'm joined by the one and only Zak Stein. Zak is, of course, a brilliant philosopher, thinker, educational a theorist, a co-founder of the Civilizational Research Institute and the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. Author, I could go on and on. Most people who, of course, will be watching this will be very familiar with Zak's work, spreading back some years now. And in the context of this conversation specifically, though, what we're going to be tackling is this recent publication, uh, First Principles and First Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta-Crisis, and the World to Come, written by one one curious character named David J. Temple, which the inside cover has some kind of connection to Dr. Zak Stein, as well as Mark Gaffney and Ken Wilber. But we'll get into maybe some of that synonymous nature of this work. But mainly, yeah, I want to dig into the content of this really interesting volume and maybe talk a little bit about where it comes from, but mostly I want to, yeah, really explore the theoretical framing of this stuff as I'll explain more in a second, I think is really important. And we'll get into that. But for now, let's just say thank you, Zak, so much for being here. Appreciate you coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm happy to talk about the book.
Awesome.
Fun.
Yeah, last time we spoke, we talked about nuancing the stage theory debate a bit. And
Right.
there's a whole other aspect I could set up in terms of your background and the work that you do that relates to developmental psychology and that sort of a thing. But you're a man who wears many hats, so we'll pick one at a time here. But this conversation is, yeah, specifically in relationship to this book, which I'm sure some people will have heard about. And let's see. I'm trying to think about the best way into this. I think probably why don't I tee you up a little bit and just give a couple minutes introduction to what this book is,
Mhm.
and kind of where it's coming from, what you hope it to accomplish, and sort of the broad kind of topic that it's addressing. And then I'd really, yeah, just love to get into the meat of it. But yeah, explain a little bit what this book is.
Totally. So as you said, it's a collaboration. Mark Gaffney and I have been working together for over a decade now. And uh and Wilbur also involved in these conversations for a very, very long time. Originally it was the Center for Integral Wisdom. Now it is the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. And Mark and I have been working on essentially a philosophical framework, a worldview, which we're calling cosmoerotic humanism. And this book is an attempt to put into one place all of the kind of the biggest ideas that constitute cosmoerotic humanism as a worldview. So it's very telegraphic, it's very condensed, it's abbreviating a lot of things that we plan to articulate in this great library of cosmoerotic humanism with its, a dozen plus volumes, which basically unpack a lot of what is within that book. And the simplest way to say it is that we are trying to find a way to revive the project of perennialism. So this is an evolving perennialism. And perennialism, of course, was the project of trying to figure out what all the world religions had in common, like this core of perennially recurring wisdom from the wisdom traditions. And Ken Wilber kind of climaxed that tradition and then constellated the postmodern reactions against it. And so what we're doing is factoring the postmodern reactions against perennialism and re-articulating it in terms of an evolving set of first principles and first values. And so in the broadest sweep of things, what we're doing here is talking about the nature and future of religion and talking about the nature and constitution of the cosmos, and specifically trying to re-ontologize value
Mhm.
as part of the cosmos. So you can think about some of the work that was done in kind of philosophy in the 70s and 80s, trying to make consciousness real again, which is to say, like, okay, we got so reductionistic and materialist here, guys. We have to talk about, does consciousness exist at all? So you get like Chalmers and
Mhm.
all these people, this whole thing about consciousness. And in a sense, that's very interesting, but consciousness just kind of sits there. It's just like whoa, 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 right? But what about like telos? What about value? And so McGilchrist most recently has said that the universe is probably made up of matter, time, space, motion, consciousness, and value. That those are the basic pieces you need to get the thing going. And so we agree. And so do the lineage traditions that we're pulling from. We're re-articulating much of the wisdom traditions as actually conversations about value and intrinsic value, the evolution of cosmic value. So we speak of a field of value, the way that one might speak of the physical fields that constitute, kind of a gross material universe. And we speak of a universal grammar of value as a context for diversity. And what that means is that we're not prescribing a particular list of values. What we're trying to do is resuscitate our ability to have a non-arbitrary discussion about what's valuable. And as an educator, this is you don't get to square one in education without having a place where you can have a non-arbitrary discussion about the nature of the good life. What does it mean to have a life that hasn't been misspent? What does it mean to have a good life? It's the most basic educational question. And we're in a culture now where most conversations about value are presumed to be arbitrary. Not that they don't matter. It just kind of only matters to you. And you can kind of have your own opinion about what's valuable. But I could have my own opinion. If we disagree, that's okay, because values are relative. Of course, if we disagreed about how to build a house, we'd have to resolve that disagreement, because the rules of the physical universe are not arbitrary, but the rules of value seem to be arbitrary in our culture. So we're saying that's incorrect, that the law of value, the grammars of value, are as real as the physical laws, and that we can, through intersubjectivity and intergenerational engagement, actually evolve and deepen our perception of value, our encoding of it, and articulation of it. And so this is kind of the first word on moving the perennial tradition into this conversation about value and refactoring things like non-duality, theology, evolutionary spirituality, in terms of this conversation about the nature of intrinsic cosmic value and our ability to perceive and to relate to it. And that opens a whole bunch of doors, which we can kind of start to walk through. But that's maybe one pretty good way in.
No, that's great. That's excellent, because that's specifically what I want to dig into and interrogate a bit is the kind of theory of value that emerges from this. And so you kind of frame that very well. I'll read a quote on page 119. You say, "We are engaged in what we understand to be the great post-postmodern project, the reconstruction of value itself, honoring both these legitimate aspects of the critiques of modernity and postmodernity, carefully and forcefully responding to the other mistaken aspects. In doing so, we seek to restore the value that was always there, but not in its pre-modern condition." And so people who will know, the stuff that I've been engaged in and what this podcast mostly focuses on, relative to metamodern spirituality, moving through the modern and the postmodern, to get to a metamodern orientation that is a reconstruction of meaning and value. All those things land in a very powerful way. So let me first say some things up front that I think, let's say, tied together all the kind of overlaps between a project like this and what I think is really, this essential postmodern project that you're describing, and name a little, gush a little bit about how important this project is, because I want to get that first, because then I want to get into then debating a little bit the specifics, because the devil's always in the details. But I mean, as I interpret you, and of course, feel free to correct me on any of this, what this book is sort of an inaugural gesture towards is trying to articulate a new worldview and a new story, after postmodern kind of deconstructions and the relativization of value, setting value on a new footing, and in the context of the meta crisis and the meaning crisis, in a way that can allow us to navigate that into a sustainable and flourishing future, I guess I would say. And again, I'm saying things that I think that this project is about, but it's also, the project I'm deeply engaged in. So I'm trying to kind of, really underscore a lot of the overlaps and sort of the shared trajectory here, and the sort of shared vision. There's also a lot in here that I think is the kind of diagnosis that I also totally share in terms of breakdowns of again meaning, value, the loss of a story, the problems of reductionism and kind of this overly materialistic scientific reductionistic orientation towards reality. That's some things askew, the environment, and then the breakdown and the crises that that's led to. And so anyway, I just want to emphasize all that because I think that we are very much tracking in the same space and our projects are very, very similar. And so to the degree that you're doing all that, I think this is excellent, and we need more people engaged in this sandbox. So that's kind of the first up, aspect of the positives here. So then it gets into how it gets into the ideas, it gets into what the actual kind of where does the rubber meet the road on all this, because then you actually have to rise to the ambitious task of presenting a new theory of value that can do what you've said, which is basically honor the legitimate aspects of the critiques of the modern and the postmodern as you reconstructively restore a sense of value in a way that, quote, is not to its pre-modern condition. So you want a non-regressive, non-reactionary move, that would just kind of restore pre-modern value notions in a kind of more classic, let's say, perennialism. And you want to do this in a way that honors the postmodern and the modern, but in a reconstructive post-postmodern project to articulate value. More or less on point so far?
I think so. And it is worth mentioning that, it's the work that has found its way into that volume, began back in 2008, in terms of the collaboration with Mark and Ken.
Yep.
And then stepping into collaboration with Mark. And so this is a project that, yes, that you and I participated in, but which has been kind of ongoing. Like
sure.
This has, as we would describe it, this kind of great postmodern project, which we're kind of honored to participate in.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's a pretty fair recommendation. And I would underscore, that it's one of the more important things that can be done, although it is in fact just some philosophy that needs doing. There's almost nothing more important than being able to find new footing for the most important values and normative frameworks that allow us to be human together. Without that, why solve the meta crisis, right? If you can't really demonstrate that it matters to solve it. So I think there is a deep alignment there, and that is what is exciting. So I'm curious to get into the detail.
So okay, so then to unpack this then, and I think explore hopefully some productive, fruitful, generative areas of disagreement, tension as to how one can go about this reconstructive project. The sense I get from what this book does, I mean, and it's in kind of the title, First Principles and First Values. There's this notion of you call it the metaphysical primitives, basically, that you're sort of working with here. This is metaphysics. The sense I get from what this is doing as a response is essentially positing value as just fundamental. It's just saying it's just axiomatically declaring value to be I forget if you call it an ontological or a metaphysical primitive. On page 199, you say value is eternal in the sense that it is sourced beneath and beyond space and time. I mean, there's a very metaphysical move that's going on here that is positioning value prior to what in some senses we would think of as the naturalistic cosmos of space-time and the physical universe, almost, that there's a metaphysical ground to this. So my question is, how is that different from a pre-modern notion of value, which you say you're trying not to do? You're trying to move beyond the postmodern critique, which really does foreground the social constructedness of value, and makes us kind of appreciate the degrees to which value is relativistic and changes cross-culturally and these sorts of things. So unpack that a little bit to someone who is sort of like, okay, great, we're looking for a postmodern approach, and then they hear that value is posited axiomatically as a metaphysical primitive.
Totally. So I think the first thing I would say is that modern science itself simply posits things as axiomatic primitives. So it's not like modern science is a practice that does not depend upon the positing of axiomatic metaphysical primitives. In fact, this is how you get a discourse going. So just the fact that we posit that doesn't make it somehow pre-modern. So for example, the Einsteinian constants, like the speed of light, gravity, the existence of gravity, all the stuff that has to be in place for the Big Bang to exist, for the microseconds after the Big Bang to bring order. So the idea, in fact, that there are cosmological primitives which express themselves across cosmological time scale through processes of self-organization and things of that nature is a profoundly modern idea, but it does rely upon the positing of certain basic primitives, So that's the first thing I would say is that, and again, as McGilchrist is arguing, if you start to look at the most deepest places where even physics is occurring, you start to get people positing consciousness, for example, as just a cosmological primitive. And so again, I don't believe that therefore they are regressing into premodernism. They're doing what science does, which is say, okay, everything about the universe is suggesting to us that actually it doesn't get started without something like this being there kind of already. And so that's the claim we're making about value, which is that it is it's not that it isn't socially constructed, it totally is. So like space and time are real, and yet we also construct space and time, right? And so similarly, value is real, but we also construct value. Time is real, and you can misgauge the time. I don't have enough time, actually. I thought I did. Value is real, and you can misperceive value. I think that's valuable, but it's actually not. Right. So so I think that's one thing. The other thing I'll say is that we're consistently trying to rationally reconstruct the most advanced scientific discourses that we can find. And so the Whiteheadian metaphysics, which kind of a Whiteheadian style of metaphysics, which Charles Sanders Peirce began, which he talked about as a scientific metaphysics, is a way of doing metaphysics that doesn't retreat back beyond the Kantian innovations that gave us modern post-metaphysical thought, but actually builds on that and moves forward by orienting generalizations across all of the best existing scientific fields and then interanimating those with the rationally reconstructed philosophical primitives. So I'd say that's the other thing I will say is that we're doing something like a scientific metaphysics, where the basic practices that allow us to be speculative are grounded in the non-speculative disciplines who cannot justify their own findings, which is to say, like, science isn't philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. Science is science. And so science is, by definition, unreflective, non-ontologizing, mm-hmm. non-speculating about what it's finding. And so then the philosopher comes in, Whitehead, and Habermas believes this is one of the roles of philosophy, is to look at the special sciences and actually rationally reconstruct what they actually mean for the life world. Mm-hmm. And so that is, again, a postmodern speculative metaphysics, which isn't denying science, but in fact is saying, okay, science, here's what I believe you're actually saying. Not science is wrong, there's something else that's more true, but rather science is partially right, but is by definition limited in its ability to make metaphysical claims and even to justify its own practices as valid. So therefore, science stands in need of philosophy and specifically cosmology and metaphysics. So that's a little bit of the way we're framing some of our claims. Yeah. That might be helpful.
Yeah, no, it's a good, some stuff to work with there. I mean, so one of the ideas though that comes to mind is that kind of using a sort of Occam's razor approach, right? There's this notion that, well, we shouldn't posit something unless we have to, right? Part of why people are starting to posit consciousness as a fundamental, as a kind of ontological primitive, is because it doesn't seem like what we have to work with can get us there, can complete the step from sort of, matter to this sort of phenomenological first person subjective experience. And because of that, it's sort of like, well, okay, what if we just posit this then as this fundamental? Whereas if you have things that are kind of causally closed, then you don't have to then posit that, right? Like when you're talking about, gravity and why, like this pen will fall, that's actually like, oh, okay, we have a pretty good causal account of that. I don't need to posit some hypothetical third thing because that'll overly complicate these things. Or you could say something like elan vital or other notions that have existed as part of scientific development, where, yeah, there couldn't seem to be a kind of satisfactory explanation with the given knowns that people then had to posit this third thing. And then sometimes, as in the case with elan vital, then those things actually get discarded when you see actually, oh no, we can more or less understand, let's say a living system without that concept if we understand cybernetics and we understand, complexity and emergence and all this stuff. That would be the kind of the case. So where I kind of come at this is sort of like, okay, then if value could be accounted for given what we currently know, we wouldn't have to posit it as a sort of metaphysical or ontological primitive. We could say, oh, okay, when you get this and you get this, and then there's something that happens between them, then you've got value, and then you don't have to do this metaphysical move. And so the claim I would want to make, and to, we can dance around, is to see why you might not find that to be satisfactory. So I'll just quickly lay this out. Obviously, these sorts of things would need, some time to really get into, but I'm working myself with a more kind of Vervaekian notion of transjectivity, right? And that if you've got something, an entity in a context, let's start with a living entity, because this is a nice place where I think people can see these things pretty clearly, but then we can also shade down or shade up, as the case may be. But like, a cell has a goal state, right? In order to maintain itself, it's got to take in, food, nutrients, and in order to sustain itself, it has to avoid toxins, right? So cells do chemotaxis, and we can see goal-directed behavior in the world. With these kinds of complex living organisms. Obviously, when you shade up to the level of complex human beings, now you've got all these other layers of complexity added in. And so our goal-directed behavior is very complex. And we've got will and we've got emotion and all these things. And, here Greg Enriquez's U-Talk model can help kind of chart how these things wind up showing up across the evolutionary stack. And then you could even, I think, go further down, shade down into the area of matter and look at things like dissipative structures that have, what Terence Deacon would call like these teleonomic, goal-directed and intentional behaviors. And if you see it in that way, then you can just say that entities, to maintain themselves, have that as a goal, you could almost posit. And so entities have values because of that. And I think, to use a very specific example to really make this clear, right? Well, do I want to get? I might save this. I'll come back to this. There's something I want to get to here about the values that show up for different kinds of organisms, because I think it illustrates the point very well. But the basic claim in this way of approaching the reconstruction of value would be that actually, yeah, physical, let's just say living organisms to start with, have goals in order to maintain themselves. And if things have goals, then there are normative aspects to their existence, right? If they don't reach their goals, then they cease to exist. And so if they are going to keep existing, then they need to meet their goals. So by virtue of it being kind of a dynamic, complex evolutionary creature, it's going to have values that are valuable for it. And that's kind of the key transjective part, that all values are valuable for things. And I guess here's where I'll bring in this last point and then get your response, is that the dung beetle, right? What's valuable to a dung beetle is dung. And you could even just say, for the sake of this illustration, that let's say that's human crap, okay? So for that creature, that crap, that poop is valuable to it. Now, as a person, that crap is not valuable to me. It is kind of, it's like, it's actually kind of my value state is to distance myself from it. So instead of being attracted to it, I am repulsed by it. Whereas the dung beetle is attracted to it instead of being repulsed by it. And because we have different values, but we are operating in what you might call that field of value, generally speaking, because we both seek to maintain ourselves and have goal-directed behavior. And so in that framing, you get that relativity of values, but you also get it framed within a broader context of all entities in context with their environment must have values if they must maintain themselves. And the big takeaway from all that would be then you don't posit value as a fundamental. It's actually inherently it's a relationship that emerges transjectively between an agent and its arena. So what do you make of all that approach, and
Uh,
why don't you find that satisfactory as an explanation for value?
uh, to well, a few things. So I think it's a false dichotomy to think that by saying something is primitive, it isn't somehow also relational, right? Um, so the idea that value is always value to something, of course,
Oh, that's
absolutely,
helpful. Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Again, consciousness similarly,
Mm,
right? Like that these are relational by their very nature. So in no way are we retreating to some kind of myth of the given, and nor are we retreating to some kind of essentialism that isn't a process-based contextual way of thinking about the emergence of anything that is actually real. So that's the first thing I'll say, which is that value is always relational, fundamentally. That's why we talk about the primitiveness of desire.
mhm.
Now, you have chosen to call both value and desire goal-orientedness, but to me, that's just you positing value as primitive, just calling it goal-directed behavior.
Mhm.
And what we're saying is that to be goal-directed is to have
Yeah.
values,
Yeah.
basically. And so I'm agreeing.
Okay.
You're using a particular kind of language, which is interesting because it seems to be more kosher scientifically to suggest that goal-directed behavior occurs. But the idea that somehow that actually you just mean the thing has a desire and a need, and therefore value is real. And then, of course, the idea that what's valuable to you isn't valuable to me. Of course, that's how values work. So the dung beetle thing, I'm like, yeah, of course. Like primary to all of that, as you pointed out again, a kind of slip of the vocabulary is life, seeking to live,
Mhm.
value.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like, so all the evolutionary psychologists smuggle in
Yeah.
this like desire to live, like wanting to continue to be. uh that is the most basic way of thinking about it, especially in the context of life, what we would think of as value. So like survival, the quest for survival is kind of posited as a primitive given in all of evolutionary biology. And Whitehead was easily pointed out, well, that just is appetite. That is the appetition of the universe. That is desire. That is value. What the ubiquitous, overwhelmingly stressful push to live shows us is that life is valuable
Mhm.
intrinsically. Um, so I'm basically in agreement. I think that, yeah, there's very important ways people consistently misunderstand value, which is that if it's a value, everyone has to hold it the same. Nope. That if it is a value, it some kind of exists like a platonic form and a disembodied kind of weird, stupid metaphysics. But we're not doing weird, stupid metaphysics.
No, that's
we've
so that's
all
very
read,
that's
we've
very
all read,
helpful.
and
I would
people,
never assume that you were doing stupid metaphysics, but it is helpful to get some clarity explicitly that it's not a kind of platonic ideal outside of, because I mean, to call something outside of space and time gestures in that direction. I think it's kind of maybe invites a little bit of thinking in those terms elsewhere. I mean, you say you refer to value as the very ground of being, the very fabric of cosmos within which we live. Value is not a contrivance, but the very air we breathe, the field of existence in which we all live and participate. We live in the field of value, and the field of value lives in us. And so when I hear that kind of language and I hear it's before space and time, my mind goes to there's some kind of like ultimate or absolute value that exists in some kind of you know a way that, I mean, because I'll put it this way, I guess, right? Like a dung beetle exists in space and time, and then and I exist in space and time, and our values then seem to be bounded by space and time. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that. How does value not become some kind of disembodied view from nowhere, myth of the given kind of platonic ideal if it is somehow also before space and time and the very fundament of being or something?
yeah. So the question of how to speak about the very mysterious nature of being, right? Like, what's the right languages to use? Many people use consciousness, right? That consciousness would be the thing that exists beneath time and space, right? Or Satchitananda, right? Being consciousness and bliss, right? Or the Tao, right? Being beneath time and space, but also constituting time and space, right? Or Brahman, right? Or God, right? So there's a bunch of terms that people use to refer to the ground of being. And so we are starting to use this term, this field of value, as a way of speaking about this thing, which is basically you cannot speak about. But the idea that there is a source from which the universe unfolds its creativity that is ever present, always already present, is what we're trying to get at. And so, for example, life, the inexhaustible kind of fountain of life. Where did this emerge from? Why did it emerge? These are some of the deepest religious questions that can be answered. And there's been a long history of speaking about them in terms of certain types of eternally existing patterns, processes. And so what we're trying to find a way to articulate is both the presence in reality of things that are truly unchanging and eternal, right? And that those very same things which undergird reality are also part of what moves through reality creatively. So it's a kind of non-dual view in which the kind of the stuff, if you will, that this is made out of is better thought of not as matter or as consciousness, but a little bit more like something like desire or eros or value or eros value, right? That's the
Yeah.
the most basic metaphysical orientation. And again, it's not, most of this doesn't get resolved linguistically. Most of this gets resolved through practices that open the eye of value, right?
Yeah.
And practices that actually give you the experience of the beauty I'm experiencing in time and space being deeper than time and space.
Yeah. And I want to in a bit get to the anthro-ontology aspect to that, where we'll probably get to some of that. But I wonder what you would make of this. And I hope, I'm glad, that there's some it seems like maybe we are hitting at the same idea. We're languaging it differently. We're drawing on different kinds of terms and frameworks, but we're kind of getting at something essentially the same, which is encouraging. So let's see if this goes in a similar direction, or if you would say, no, I don't think that that's quite right. So one of the kind of seeming insights of Darwinian evolution is a kind of response to that whole issue of, why is life, not to say where did life come from, but why does life continue? Which is essentially a kind of tautology, right? Which is that if there is not a desire to struggle for existence, let's just say, then that thing is going to more likely die and then not pass on its genes and so on and so forth. And so meaning that what perpetuates does so because it desires its perpetuation. And there's a kind of almost kind of ontological reality then to that seems to me to be where this kind of bottoms out. Because to then again, there's a similar move. It seems like we're maybe unnecessarily positing this thing called eros or desire in a metaphysical way, if you can account for the same phenomenon kind of intrinsically on its own terms, right? So like, if I don't,
how did you just account for that phenomenon? You didn't. You accounted for it with a different type of verbal display than the one that I would choose. The one that I would choose is that there's some irreducible thing which we could call eros. You're saying no, there's some irreducible thing which we would call life.
well, no, yeah. So no, this is really good. So let's try to get some clarity here. So what I would say is, let's just start with life, because we have to start somewhere. If we go too far back into the physical evolutionary past, things become more speculative.
What
Do
do you mean?
what do I mean by life? I mean, a autopoetic, self-organizing, complex, dynamic, dissipative structure that maintains itself by taking energy in from its environment and sort of exporting its entropy, and then it uses genetic information to reproduce itself through time, I guess. And on Earth, this is a carbon-based, water-based sort of phenomenon, but it could possibly exist in another capacity. And so with a framing or definition like that, I think you can do the kind of move of then seeing how this shades down into prebiotic levels as well. So a lot of this, I think, will be language stuff, and you know, conversations or debates over semantics can be, maybe sometimes they're a waste of time, but sometimes they're incredibly fruitful just to be like,
It's
oh, we're
also,
actually talking about the same thing. Yeah.
also rhetorical. It's also
Yes.
rhetorical.
Yes. Right.
Depending on what you're trying to affect with the text, like
Yeah.
who you're speak to.
Exactly. And I want to bring that up in a second too, around the issue of intimacy, which relates to this also as well, talking about eros. But just to bring that point back then, in a kind of, let's say, universal Darwinistic perspective, or just for the time being, sticking with standard Darwinism, that what lives is that which desires life. There's a kind of, if it didn't, then it wouldn't exist, and then it wouldn't live, right? And there's a kind of then just kind of causal closure to that, that then you can say, all right, that is the basis, you might suggest,
So
of
desire.
Yeah.
Desire being the basis. Cool. That's what we're saying.
Well, maybe what I'm feeling
just
here,
said-
responding to, is there's a sense of maybe, I mean, maybe I'm doing this and reading into the text too much, but I get a sense of reification, right? That like what we're talking about is a process.
Why didn't you just reify? Why didn't the Darwinian thing reify? It seemed to be basically a tautology that prefers a materialistic connotation to language, and also prefers a connotation to the language that describes a tautology that is alienating to the human, which is to mean I don't see myself in the cosmic process you're describing. Whereas we're trying to describe the tautology, admitting it's a tautology, not pretending that it is not a tautology, and saying that we're trying to describe it in a way that we actually see ourselves in, which is to say, it's like desire without blushing. And we talk about the movement towards and the expression of value, intimacy, those types. Now, we are actively working with biologists and other people to do the kind of isomorphism of that language and say, basically, you're saying at the root of this autopoetic thing is desire to live. And we're saying that too. We're just emphasizing desire as cosmic root, that actually the cosmos has an appetite.
Yeah. And that's just the thing I'm trying to get because here's the thing. It's not just semantics if, as in this case, right, you're actually positing a metaphysical system built on something. And in that case, then we have to talk about it as having a kind of independent reality, which could get us into the troubling waters of misplaced concreteness and reification
But explain to me why the Darwinians aren't doing that.
Because it's when you're talking about a process itself that has its own causal closure to it, then you don't have to posit or reify any kind of third thing that kind of is.
But you're positing autopoiesis and causal closure, like those. Where are those?
Well, those are processes, though. They're not. And again,
those desire is necessarily processual.
Yeah. So then,
the Darwinian thing, survival by natural selection, blah blah. That is a very reified metaphysical view, which is actually no longer accepted by most biologists. Much more complex things are happening in terms of self-organization, in terms of horizontal gene transfer, in terms of all kinds of stuff, right? So the Darwinian thing to me is radically reified, and actually a metaphysics that's smuggled it through in scientific language. We're trying to say, like, no, do your metaphysics clean, which means do metaphysics. Don't do something that pretends to be science, but is actually as reified, making as many assumptions, positing as many unjustifiable axiomatic primitives as our metaphysics. It just happens to be the thing that the kind of cynical, nihilistic scientists who are in power would be comfortable with you saying. Whereas we're saying, no, like, those guys are driving us insane, and we need to find a language to describe the universe that makes us home in the universe. To actually have this to be moral.
I think in trying to clarify too the difference maybe between, this book, what this is doing and how it's presenting it, and the semantics and the rhetoric and the system and the things that I'm trying to foreground relate to this as part of the issue. Because for me, I do feel at home in the evolutionary process as described by, kind of biology, absent, let's say, the absent positing a metaphysical primitive of value. Like when I see that things sort of cash out even further down at kind of a thermodynamic level, right? That to me is like profound, and it helps kind of present a one world cosmos, where a lot of the metaphysics that I would say kind of winds up getting smuggled into worldviews doesn't we don't kind of need to posit those things. We can do it much more simplistically in a very elegant way, I think, in a way that's also very beautiful and fundamentally at home. It makes me feel homed in the universe because going down to atoms all the way up to us, there's a one kind of integrated evolutionary process that is leading to energy moving through systems, organizing them into increasingly complex forms. And I am part and parcel of that. And so is a whirlpool. And that to me is beautiful. But so I'm trying to come at it more from the way of like encouraging people to see their unity with the whirlpool in a way that I think is very poetic. Whereas I think also historically, maybe some of that has been alienating and pushes people towards nihilism because they say, oh, I guess there's no difference between me and a whirlpool, which is false because of the complexity layers involved. But so I think properly understood, I don't think that these kinds of ways of framing them do need to be nihilistic. I think that they can be wonderfully explanatory and not necessarily lead to nihilism if they're properly clarified in the broader sweep of things. That'd be my take, though. I also understand that, yes, and I would totally agree with, historically speaking, the modern, uh, you know, modern, Darwinistic, reductionistic approach to seeing the world is an inherently, I think, bleak one that has historically led to a lot of the meaning crisis that we're experiencing, and that does need to be corrected for. The way that I'm trying to do that is move through it, and for me, I'm like, but I don't think that leads us to have to posit this thing of value as quote unquote fundamental, unless again we're just needing to kind of
But I think
translate that.
it sounded to me to be basically semantic, rhetorical slash aesthetic, because
Mhm.
everything about the universe and being a part of it is what we are
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
And in fact, we were working very hard to look at the sciences and find ways to grapple with the rearticulation of the sciences.
Yeah.
So I see them as very, very similar. Now, I think the difference would be just, you know, the the problem of language as these processes cross different stratum in the evolutionary dynamic.
Mhm.
And so the rift that then occurs with the emergence of the human
Mhm.
being, from my perspective, too profound
Mhm.
in the nature of these other languages, because then you start to get all this other stuff that starts to happen
Mhm.
isn't happening along these other
Right.
languages. Now, how did we get all of this other very complex stuff? And so I'm saying, like, I'm basically saying, I'm kind of pushing on that notion that we're actually at home in the universe when we understand ourselves as just energy, which has arbitrarily brought itself together. Um, which so questions of freedom and personhood, for example, to me are primary in these discussions, because personhood and freedom are categories which have no place in the more reductive languages of evolutionary psychology. And so I think that to me is a deep, deep question about the kind of inadequacies of
Yeah.
the cosmologies.
Yeah. And again, there our projects are totally synced up with each other. I think we're again trying the whole postmodern reconstructive project to reframe a value emerges as a necessary response to the meaning crisis and the nihilism generated by these various modern and postmodern critiques. And with the modernists, you see this kind of, mechanistic, materialistic, deterministic reductionism, which leads to just a a wiping away of, you could say, the field of value. And with the postmodern critiques, with the radical relativism, the radical relativization of value, you see that happen. Part of why I think a postmodern project that is successful in reconstructing value has to move in this direction that I'm trying to articulate in is because it also accepts both of the genuine insights in the same way that you mentioned, yours is doing, that your project is trying to do, that it accepts the genuine insights of the modern and the postmodern, which in this case I think is like evolution, and the appreciation that values are socially constructed, which does not mean that they're not real. And it just means that they're inflected through social constructs. And
yeah, that's the idea. Like if
Yeah.
you can find a way to preserve value in a non-arbitrary way in the face of modern evolutionary sciences and in the face of modern humanities studies, then you've succeeded. And so we're trying to do that, I think, just a different way. We are actively engaging with all of the most advanced biological theories and then just kind of like re-articulating and showing. And then, value constructivism, again, as a Piagetian, like that, you just said, anything I think about value, I think about it in terms of that Piagetian lens, which means it's an active construct engagement with this moral / ethical reality. So there's a pretty easy way actually to factor the cultural relativist critiques if you go developmental and constructivist.
Definitely.
That story bleeds into the cosmological story. And it's actually Piaget's work in evolutionary biology is another place to look for this. So like biology and knowledge. I don't know if you've hung out with that. Biology, he's saying our thing.
And he's bringing in all the cybernetics and the early, dissipative structures even is in there. Pre-Eugenie sites.
Waddington. Totally. So there's that long discourse. And the question, well, several questions. One is like, all the different ways that this project needs to articulate itself, meaning like it's good that we're not redundant in our articulation because not everyone is vibing on the same thing. Right. And when we talk about this world religion and philosophy, cosmoerotic humanism is not an attempt to be the world. Like anyone who's doing that is nuts. You don't want to be the world philosophy or religion. The point is that there's this emerging space of discourse where different types of topics are emerging, and it's these types of topics. It's the one trying to bring unity to the modern scientific worldview for the sake of value. The projects that are attempting to make sense of the great wisdom traditions rather than just denigrate them. And it's a planetary discourse, meaning that it is taking into account as much as possible everything that we have learned about cultural history from all the planet and the existing state of the tech and civilizational infrastructure, meaning it's an urgent project. We see the world in crisis. And so that's this emergent place where years from after we're forgotten, there will solidify something that actually encodes this grammar of value that we've been speaking to so inarticulately in some type of planetary scale normative framework. And the great religious traditions have actually been local traditions with planetary ambitions. They started in little places and then tried to spread everywhere. The world philosophy religion of the future begins as a planetary movement, and we just haven't seen it yet. And so a lot of this is like, may many flowers bloom in different ways of articulating this, a lot of bumping together, and then at some point, beyond our control, I believe, because we're entering it, there will be truly emergent movements that change the mood of the culture. So like if you think about like what human those guys are doing when modernity started was trying to talk everyone out of the idea that the universe was meaningful. So like for the vast majority of human history, everyone basically believed that this is totally meaning, everything's meaningful. I'm meaning, like I was placed here by God, like we all were, and every tree was made by God, and like it's all meaningful. And then the modernity comes along, and they basically, in a very systematic way, begin to talk us out of the idea that the universe was meaningful. I believe we're in a situation now of having to talk ourselves back to the idea that this is meaningful. And our generation is in that discussion. Meaning that it's actually, even when we say we believe it's meaningful, it's actually hard to take drugs and stuff to have the experience. Like it's hard because we didn't We grew up in the default nihilism of the materialism of late capitalism. But the future, I believe, generations, it will be the case again
Yeah.
that the culture has changed, the mood of the culture, that there's enough practices and these types of things where now you can be raised into a place of actually intrinsic meaningfulness, intrinsic.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. At the same time, I guess the question would be, so it seemed like I would say that the early moderns, including Hume, especially maybe Hume, were also, well, as Kant would say, waking people up from their dogmatic slumbers about
Of course,
value. So
remember
like,
the cruelties, Voltaire. Remember the
right,
cruelties. Like religion was terrible. And
but
some of the
yeah,
meanings were meaningless. Some of the
yeah.
meanings were meaningless. Right.
And so I think that it's also easy, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I do see this sometimes in certain framings of looking at modernity and being like, oh, we all went, it all that ruined everything. And rather than, and you do see this in the book, that this is actually a maturation process moving through modernity. And so I very much look at it as like, yes, we were inculcated with certain notions, just the intuitive sense of the meaningfulness of things, but then we needed to critically interrogate that. Maybe we weren't quite actually accurate about how that meaning was operating. We were working with sort of a working heuristic that when
Right.
you really applied your kind of your critical gaze to it, you're like, oh, this doesn't quite work. And then
Yep.
we've had to cycle through these different epochs of like dealing with the increasing insights. And I do agree now that moving from the modern into the postmodern and now into this post-postmodern, which I call the metamodern, is this time when we're like, yeah, they were right to have poked and prodded and seen that loose argument there and kind of deconstructed the edifice. But now we can see how to put things back together again, and hence a reconstruct, a notion of value. So I always like to make that case because sometimes I think it can get lost in the rhetoric, I suppose, which is where I want to turn to next. But yeah, because again, if we're running away from modernity, that's the danger. And
Yeah.
and yeah,
Well,
so
and
yeah.
you have to see modernity as a type of learning process,
Right.
right? Habermas does this really well in that most recent book, where he just
Hmm.
talks about this. The traditions had to absorb the cognitive advances that they couldn't stop from accumulating.
Yeah.
Eventually, the cognitive advances became science, and then we get modernity.
Hmm.
But the cold versus the warm stream of modernity being very important. Hume and others being cold stream, saying the traditions have nothing to teach us. Kant and Hegel and others being the warm stream, saying actually no, the traditions were very important. There's untapped semantic potential
Yeah.
in these religious traditions, but that doesn't mean we stop the dance with scientific knowledge and technological advancement. In fact, it's the technology advancement that's done more than the science to dysregulate the life world. And it's the technology development now that calls for the most urgent reorientation to value, because we're about to make technologies that are ungovernable in their power and not aligned with value.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's so much more that we could keep talking on this value
mhm.
front. And in some way, part of me wants to do that because it's really important, I think, that we do this. I totally agree with you that we need multiple iterations of this and that, may a thousand flowers bloom and all that. But with the wrong metaphysics, we can pretty easily slip back into certain kinds of pre-modern modes of thinking that I don't think will be operating at the level of complexity that we need to deal with these huge meta crisis problems that we're facing. And so I'm always very keen to really get clear about how this reconstructive process is working. I think though, in talking to you now, it seems like we are, syncing up a lot more, maybe potentially than I get the impression that than from this book, which raises the question though about rhetoric, because and like the audience and who like a work like this is aimed for or aimed at, and specifically maybe a way of approaching that issue for me is around the way that you talk about intimacy, which is pretty core in this framework. You talk about intimacy crisis, and you talk about this process of desire leading to allurement, leading to the sense of coming together and singular aspects coming together into more novel wholes that are maintaining their individuality but also merging into something greater, and that this is the process of evolutionary unfolding, all of which I agree with. But to use a word like intimacy then raises a rhetorical question, right? Because And here's the question. I guess I'll frame it this way. Like, um, what do you think it does? How is it helpful to frame everything in terms of intimacy? Uh, how might that be helpful, but how might that also be misleading or confusing?
Interesting. So when we say intimacy, of course, we don't mean like, you know, some kind of trite romantic sense of intimacy. We don't mean that at all. It's more in the sense of, you know, Dogen saying something like enlightenment being intimacy with all things. Um, and so the term intimacy is really just the most accurate description that we could find of what the phenomena was. Like you can, and if you kind of are able to disentangle it from whatever reactive emotional complex that we have that's resistant to embracing intimacy. So that's the first thing. Why do we have a problem with that word if it is actually the most best to actually describe it? So it's just descriptively accurate that these are configurations of increasingly intimate things, that your nervous system, from just a sheer stuff connected to other stuff being a definition of intimate, is the most intimate thing in the universe, and it is through its perceptual apparatus making you inseparably intimate with your perceptual around and the air and all these other things. So for me, it's primarily descriptive, but it's also about finding these languages that are both scientifically accurate and descriptive and psychologically evocative and therefore ennobling.
Mm-hmm.
That the same dynamic that draws cells together draws people together,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, and that our experience of seeking, wanting intimacy, loneliness, that the experience of loneliness isn't some psychopathology, that it's actually the universe like needing others,
Mm.
needing you to need others, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that sense of the, so that's some of the language choice there, but it is in fact just very descriptively, that's just what it,
Yeah.
what
So, but it's interesting because as you define intimacy, I think that a term like complexity captures more or less the same thing. It just has a different connotation. Because a word like intimacy, I would posit, does have the connotations immediately of a relationship, a human relationship, a kind of emotional and psychological connection with another person. That's my immediate go-to sort of association when I hear that word, which then becomes hard to relate that far down the complexity stack at the level of an atom. Now, let me say too, I I know there are inherent, as you mentioned earlier, linguistic difficulties with this. I do this myself with the term learning, which I get from
right.
I kind of take a different tack and tend to focus more on the learning process, but I do think that there's profound continuity with what you're describing and the learning process as well. But like I think you could say that in some sense, like a whirlpool is learning to the degree that it's relating to information, its environment, and this sort of a
Sure.
thing.
Yeah,
But I
yeah,
also own like at that level, that's mostly just it's mostly metaphor and poetry, but the by virtue of it having a very real continuity with what we are doing as humans when we talk about learning, it's not an unjustified use of the term. And
right.
so for me, I don't know, there's something about really wanting to be very clear about that. Whereas in this book, I feel like there is much more kind of leaning into that poetic language that, let's say, a scientist reading this might be like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with them using this word intimacy, because intimacy, if it does connote all those things, requires like a nervous system and a social context and a mind and all this stuff, right? And so that'd be my thought, is like the potentially overly anthropomorphic aspects that we might be imbuing onto, subatomic particles or something.
Totally. I mean, yes, the in one sense, if you're unable to drop the emotional connection to the term intimacy as having to be the thing you didn't want to have with your mom or something, and actually if you have it just as descriptive, I don't see it as any less adequate a scientific descriptor. And so the complexity actually becomes inadequate beyond a certain point, whereas intimacy never becomes inadequate. And you don't have to posit the interiority of the experience of intimacy to describe something as intimately connected to something else, right? Like actually mutually, completely entangled, no intention of ascribing subjectivity. And yet it is also a term that works as both subjective and objective. So one of the things we're trying to do is find words, unlike complexity, bridge the gap between the subjective and the objective. So integrity is another one. These are the terms that are useful in languages of strong evaluation, or terms that are both denotative and normative, right?
Well,
so because that's the other thing is complexity is not good or bad. Complexity is not good or bad. Intimacy has a normative loading. Intimacy is good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And that's interesting. I tend to imbue the notion of complexity with a normative aspect.
That's my point.
Yeah.
So much metaphysics gets smuggled into this language you think isn't metaphysics. Somehow that's less metaphysical. In fact, it's just as metaphysical. You just have a preference for an aesthetic of a certain kind of metaphysics and are worried about what the scientists are going to think of you. Many of the scientists who read this work, including very advanced biochemists, really loved the equations, and the intimacy ones in particular, in terms of descriptions of chemical process. When you look at chemical process and you look at two chemicals coming together to form some kind of catalytic reaction, and you start to think about that in terms of increasing intimacy and patterns of intimacy and actually allurement and things going into certain slots, and it starts to be kind of hard not to anthropomorphize that process. First of all, mostly the scientists start to use teleological language, even though they don't want to be teleological. They can't not describe the thing as wanting to do something.
Yeah.
So then the intimacy language kind of liberates the descriptive ability to see what's going on and allows us to talk about at these higher levels, not having to jump ship from the scientific language into the unscientific language of intimacy and interiority. And we're saying basically we don't want to jump ship. We want to have one language all the way down and all the way up, and not be like somehow more concerned about attributing things to the universe than not attributing things to the universe. Because that's the thing. It's like, why would we err on the side of making the universe less conscious, less full of value, less alive, less intention, less teleology? Why would we err? Why would we want to err on that side rather than erring on the other side?
Yeah.
A scientific bias. It's an enculturated scientific bias. And you mentioned Occam's razor, of course, Occam being the one who initiated nominalism against Duns Scotus, Duns Scotus being Peirce's hero, because Duns Scotus was saying, realism, there's things in the universe that exist and pre-exist us. It's not just about nominalism and the simplest explanation. It's about the explanation that's actually true, which is what anomalous.
I would make, sorry.
Well, I was just saying that we have to be careful with the way that epistemologies have like infiltrated us and kind of biased us against a whole bunch of ways of speaking. And so a little bit of this project, you call it poetic, but I would say it's not poetry. It's not mythology. It's actually reality. We're trying to find words to describe reality, as opposed to like Brian Swim and other people who reinterpret science mythologically.
Right.
We're actually saying this isn't poetry or myth. The universe moves towards increasingly intimate configurations, which express more and more eros. But it's not a metaphor. That's reality.
Yeah.
You could describe that as more and more complexity that throughputs more energy in life. And I'm saying, okay, that's great, but that's just an aesthetic of metaphysics that you prefer.
So yeah, but so I want to respond to that though, because so I partly agree with that, but I do think there's some meaningful things going on there as well. And I think you could make an argument both at the level of rhetoric and at the level of let's just say the evidentiary basis for making certain kinds of claims about reality. And on the rhetoric front, to go back to the idea of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, if we're basically trying to do the same postmodern reconstructive project, then it's like, yeah, we need people to be articulating this for different audiences and in different languages. And in that sense, like, great. And I think it's a bit pejorative to say, well, some people are just going to worry what the scientists are thinking, but I don't see it that way. I think it's more, we need language that will work in academic scientific contexts. We need to shift the paradigm, And that means relating to different kinds of mimetic tribes and using words and languages that are going to resonate with different groups of people. And to that end, I would say a book like this is going to work very well with some groups and not others, as every text does. I think that in some ways, if there is the kind of conceptual overlap to the degree that it seems like maybe there is, a work like this and a work like Bobby Azarian's The Romance of Reality are essentially doing the same thing. But I think, Bobby's book is going to play well and does in amongst cosmologists and physicists and even skeptics. Whereas I think like Michael Shermer would not give a glowing review for this book in the way that he would for Bobby. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we need multiple articulations of these ideas.
I think Bobby's off.
Oh, okay. Well,
because again, it's back to this question of value, right?
Mhm.
Like, so yeah, there's a lot to say here.
Well,
and again,
yeah, I know there's a lot there, but let me just make, yeah, go on.
Well, what does it mean to push on the language of the paradigm, right? Like, is it just using the language they're already using so that they're like, oh, cool, they're saying what I'm saying. I like it. In which case you didn't. You just slipped through and actually had to become interpretable as saying something like the universe is meaningful.
Right.
You have to become interpretable as saying something like the universe is meaningless.
That's just equivocation.
That's just equivocation. And that's what I see Bobby doing. That's what I see most other people do, who are trying to slip their work through the gatekeepers of academia. And again, do that, please. But at the same time, it's kind of like, there are much, much, much more radical stances that can be taken.
Yeah. And I think this is a more radical stance. And we're all welcome to our interpretations of those things. I think Bobby's work it's precisely pushing on the paradigm, and it's bringing people along who, when you frame it a certain way, they're like, oh yeah, well, I guess I could get behind that, in a way that if you were to frame it using more religious language, they would immediately be like, no, thank you. And I don't think that that's equivocation. I think that that's meaningful translation with a kind of, honestly, a kind of pedagogical import to it. It's actually, I think it's leveling up the discourse. But so I would say all that. But then the evidentiary aspect for this, which we probably actually do disagree on, or at least there's more light between us on this issue, is that one of the whole things for me about this process is that we can emphasize the continuity or we can emphasize the discontinuity. Both are going on. And you mention this in the book too. You draw attention to this. But I think that for whatever reason, maybe it's temperament, maybe it's paradigm, I'm not sure, I like to emphasize as well a lot of that discontinuity, so that we're very clear about the novel things that are showing up the complexity stack. And again, a paradigm or a framework like Greg Enriquez's U-Talk is really helpful in something like this, where you appreciate, oh yeah, the reason why, human phenomena, all these new things start showing up is because you get new complexity dynamics with a new information processing system and minds, using linguistic justification and all that. And once you see that stacking, you're like, yes, there's continuity in how this all emerged, but then we have to be careful about the language that we're applying to each, kind of layer of the stack. And yeah, and so I guess
we understand the project. We understand the project as being trying to find those languages that can be rearticulated. And often it is the case that new language has to be used at each development level. And so the continuity thing is very significant. And we talk about that pretty explicitly in the book, saying, listen, we're, of course we're not saying the stupid thing that the atom has, the hots for the other atom in the way that you do for a girl or something, right? Of course we're not saying. So there's this way in which, the gradation of languages is important. And I think, again, rhetorically, we're emphasizing, I think, continuity, because I see that one of the main pathologies and dangers of modernity is being overemphasis on discontinuity. And to the extent that we can't even explain how the human could be here at all. Whereas I'm saying the focus on continuity allows us to say, oh, the human's here because kind of like the destined form almost.
Right. Well, and one aspect of this also I think is worth mentioning, which is, how do I say this? That you do also posit as a primitive interiority. And I don't know how a word like panpsychism lands with you if you would say, yeah, that's the paradigm that we're working in, or something like that. Or I know some people that they don't like that term, but there is an element here going on in which there is, in an integral sort of way, there's interiority all the way down, which is different from an emergent, theory of mind and consciousness and that sort of a thing.
Depends how you say it. Depends what you
Right.
mean by saying it's all the way down. Doesn't mean that it's the same all the way down. It means
Right.
that it means that there has to be something there.
Yeah.
That's it. So these are, of course, classic philosophical debates, and we are positing something like panpsychism, but again, it would be not consciousness. Like consciousness just sits there. Consciousness is not dynamic. We're talking about telos. We're talking about value. We're talking about appetition, desire, the thing that moves. Consciousness perceives, right? So panpsychism, insofar as that there's just some awareness everywhere, gets us almost nothing. What we're looking for is actually appetition everywhere, meaning the will of the universe, right? So like, which would mean, what do I do, right? If it's just consciousness, then what do? I just sit here and observe as a witness. But if it's will, if it's telos, if it's eros, desire, then my main concern is the clarification of my own will. What do I do? What ought I do? Not how do I perceive the world, but how do I act in the world? That's the basic question. And so that becomes, I think, so it's not technically panpsychism because it's it's something else.
Yeah. One last way that just occurred to me that would be helpful, and I think there's something to this, and I think despite these, the colors of the flowers blooming focus on these different ways that we conceptualize, these dynamics that we're talking about. And so for me, I think it's important to appreciate that change through to use an example, when you pull the stopper in your bathtub, right, it drains out and forms a gyre. Now that is sort of that's a natural movement, and you could say that water has a desire to be at a lower level than it's currently at, right? You could use that kind of a language, that there's a gradient, right, and that the desire of that gradient is to reach sort of equilibrium, right? And so you could use that language, but what's interesting, and the point I would want to make, is that I don't think that actually, I would be averse to using that language in that context. And I think that what you can say is that there's just a natural tendency of the universe to homogenize gradients, and that as that process unfolds and becomes more complex, you start to see, basically, and this is like the dissipative structure stuff, right? That things do that, but then they form organized structures in more complex ways to dissipate the gradient. But what's interesting is that as you get up to high levels of complexity, it actually isn't anymore best understood as things doing that to dissipate the gradient, which would be to say to create entropy. It's actually, you can say, we create entropy to do other things, right? It would be silly to say that my computer exists to create heat. That's not it's telos, right? But it does need to create heat in order to have the energy running through it to do what it does. Whereas when these processes get going, that kind of telos is more immediately just kind of thermodynamic in nature. And so this has actually led some people to make this profound confusion. In fact, Carl Sagan's son, Dorian Sagan, I think, wrote a book about this. And this is actually very important with the stuff related to X risk that you're also engaged in, because some people take this as the telos of existence, which is to create entropy as quickly as possible, right? These accelerated, what are they called? Effective accelerationist.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So they have this whole notion that the thermodynamic imperative of reality is to create entropy. And so we'll just, ride that lightning, which is totally wrong. It's totally got the thing backwards, that we
but it's bad metaphysics.
Yes, it's bad metaphysics. Exactly. And
go on.
Well, just to finish this thought, I just think that it's important to appreciate that what starts in some way down here, actually, you need a different descriptive language up here by the time you've gotten to a certain complexity level. And
but these are two very different processes. So this is a classic discussion in the discussion of complex dynamical systems and emergent properties, right? So the case of a whirlpool forming, similar to the case of a hurricane forming, is something that is occurring at the level of physics. And it is a very different type of emergent phenomenon than what is occurring in, let's say, embryogenesis,
Mhm.
or the movement from multicellular to single cellular to multicellular, and these things that are stacked,
Yeah.
hierarchically emergent phenomenon,
Mhm.
which are not like whirlpools at all. So the idea that like, well, the whirlpool does this thing and then up here it does something else, we're actually looking at two very different
So you would say
trajectories.
there's not continuity there. There you would emphasize the discontinuity.
No, I would say it's a metaphysically different kind of process. So like planets forming, nebulas forming, whirlpools forming, storms forming. These are non-biological forms of self-organization, which themselves never lead to biological forms of organization. And then there are forms of self-organization that are autocatalytically closed biologically, which then give rise to these very complex phenomena that we witness in humans. So
Okay.
the emergent phenomena of that thing, of the whirlpool, just like they talk about like, well, there's hydrogen and oxygen, and then there's wetness, and wetness is an
Right.
emergent property. People, that's not the same kind of emergent
Yeah.
property as the whirlpool. Neither is the whirlpool the same as the emergent property of the embryo that is
So
moving.
you don't buy the narrative of these dissipative structures being what leads to abiogenesis and then
Oh, at some point in very deep cosmo, but the hurricane's not going to turn into
no,
something else.
no, of course not. But it's the same
This is
principles.
But is it? Because that those principles ended up getting a whole stack that has not stopped
Yeah.
self-organizing in complexity,
Yeah.
whereas the other ones have not. So I'm not saying there isn't some back end of like kind of like mereology, meaning like the study of categories and kind of like, okay, there's some common thing. But in terms of the actual movements of the material cosmos, these are different types of streams. And the ones that's more interesting in terms of emergent phenomena are these ones where you get these complex, hierarchical, compounded individuals of stacked
Mhm.
emergent phenomena, like in an
Yeah.
embryo. Um, and embryogenesis is one of the clearest places to see the whole cosmos
Hmm.
into a little developmental process. And like to look at that and not see teleology, like, and to look at that into anyway, so and intimacy and all of this, they're all there.
Yeah.
That's where so developmental psychology started there. And so yeah, but that said, the whirlpool is of course goes from being a bunch of disconnected water molecules to being a bunch of intimately
Mhm.
connected molecules.
I I I am very inclined. I'd be curious. I mean, this book that I'm writing, I wonder if when you engage with that, or if you engage with that, if you do say, "Oh yeah, we are talking about the same thing," or we're not, because I see this all as a profound continuity. And if you look at like the work Jeremy England's doing with dissipative adaptation, you can start to see the deep thread that connects, yeah, I believe us to, whirlpools as dissipative structures, not in a reductive way, obviously, but in the sense of these things build on themselves and lead to more complex entities that, of course, yes, then you do start getting radically different behavior with will and intentionality and all that stuff. But I am inclined to, and the reason why I think this is all very relevant is that I would say that there is value for a whirlpool. Because it's got goal directed behavior, and for it to maintain itself it needs to do a certain thing. If it doesn't, then it doesn't exist and there is no whirlpool. And so for me, that's that. I We agree at that a very profound fundamental level that for something to exist means it has value, because if it
Yes.
doesn't have value it's not going to exist.
Yes.
I think how we might square that exactly, and how we might, the language you might use might be somewhat different.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's another way of thinking about evolutionary selection.
Yeah.
Again, Darwin's kind of smuggle in this idea that like, oh, the universe actually chooses some things and doesn't choose other things.
Yeah.
Like it selects for things, and if it's selected for, it means it had value, by almost by definition. So even that simple notion of like survival, the simple notion of selection, both of them load, without saying it, value.
Well, one
And
question on that front though is there are also things that emerge from evolution that it would be hard, at least from our vantage, to see as valuable. I mean, there are destructive memes, right? And like certain forms of
now you're
things
talking about
toxically. What's that?
now you're talking about anti-value. Anti-value is a whole other thing.
Okay.
Because, and this is why we talk about evil in the book. As soon as you start to kind of open this door towards value realism, you start to get a whole bunch of other processes that become possible. So
Parasitic on value processes.
yes, precisely. So the eye of anti-value is the eye that perceives value in order to destroy value, the predatory eye. Not relativistic. Relativistic could give a crap if it's valuable or not. The eye of anti-value hones in on the sacred to destroy the sacred.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what we see, and that's a distorted, like reverse rotation of some of the self-organizing dynamics that build around value. So indeed, even in evolutionary history, we begin to see anti-value. But humans, again, instantiate out anti-value in a kind of reflective way, meaning that nature is not evil, but humans can be evil. Um, and that's very important to get, is that there is anti-value in nature, but it's not evil. As soon as you get the reflective pursuit of anti-value as such, that becomes evil. And again, not relativism. Relativism, who cares? The evil is like, oh, that's actually valuable. I'm going to incorporate it into myself. That's actually valuable. I'm going to use it to aggrandize myself. That's actually valuable. I'm going to kill it so that I can be the only thing valuable. Psychopathy is the clearest way to see that, which is the profound distortion in the ability to perceive what's valuable. And so civilizationally, we're running massive psychopathy, anti-value, in a huge way now. That's why this conversation is so important, because in the absence of a coherent conversation about value, you get relativism, but that turns into eventually to anti-value. It does not stay relativism. It turns into this thing that exploits value, takes advantage of value, hunts down value, those kinds of things. So in socialization dynamics, that's very clear. In the absence of a positive introject, meaning the absence of someone you actually could admire and bring into yourself to kind of form your conscience, you will bring in to your psyche the thing you fear the most in order to protect yourself from it. So you will become the omnipotent predator. You will become psychopathic because you have never witnessed anything actually satisfying value. And so you become this thing that destroys value. So then that's, I think, one of the reasons people like to avoid the conversation about value. And one of the reasons we kind of got out of the whole premodern thing, because then there's this whole other discourse. As soon as you get into the good and the bad, and then you start to ontologize the good and the bad, then you get into this whole other discourse about evil and about the ontology of evil, and about our own propensities to engage anti-value. If you are a relativist, you're off the hook, because you can't actually really be that bad of a person.
And there's also the enduring performative contradiction of the relativist, who is always acting from value by necessity.
So that's why you can't actually. That's why the anti-value ends up inhabiting you, because fooling yourself, and then you begin to fool others, and then you do relate to value, but you don't admit that you do. And then you just prey upon it. And and that's one of the main thrusts of the project, is actually that, is to change again the culture so that we can identify evil, which right now we don't have the ability to identify evil. We can't really even speak about it.
I that would be itself the basis for a future conversation. I know we're kind of starting to run out of time here, and I'd really wanted to talk about the anthro-ontology part. Maybe that could also be something we could eventually return to. If you have like maybe 5 more minutes, though, I do want to ask one last question, which I think is important for framing some of this, which has to do with the God question, I guess. And I remember you saying in a context talking about this, that a tree has value in a kind of absolute sense. And it kind of seemed to get down to the issue of, well, there's God. And so, even if no one, it's kind of like what Milton says, that if all else err, there's still kind of this truth. And so it's sort of like, we could all miss the fact that this tree has value, but there's this sort of, it sounded to me a little bit like that there's a God's eye view. And so that is sort of the way we can talk about value. But based on everything we've been talking about, it would also seem like that would be a very hard view to maintain. So maybe I'll just, invite you to say, what do you see is the place that the word God occupies in this framework?
Right. Totally. Yeah. So what to say about this? So there's a phrase that has come out of cosmoerotic humanism, which we believe is just another way to refer to God, which is, we just talk about the infinite intimate. So the infinite intimate. And theologically, this would be like panentheism, that the view of the divine espoused by cosmoerotic humanism is one of complete immanence and complete transcendence. And the field of value, as we try to define it, is both of those. Samsara and nirvana are one, that the field of value is beneath time and eternal, and yet constantly changing and evolving in time. And so, yeah, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. We're not speaking to that God. The God is understood in the Hebrew tradition as the Elohim, right? As the froth, as this complex cosmic body. Um, that's a little bit closer, but it is the case that speaking about value and specifically speaking about intrinsic value and the kind of like immanence of intrinsic value, the kind of always already presence of the intrinsically valuable, that is a way I believe, that's the way I kind of speak of God. So instead of evoking something which completely gives you the wrong connotation and has you think about some old guy with a beard or whatever, right? Instead, you speak about this field of intrinsic value that's always already present, which then you can relate to. Because if it's a field of value, it means you learn from it, you learn in relation to it, it guides you. And then ultimately, the clarification of the will or the clarification of desire being the core practice is a way of relating to God, because it's a way of saying, okay, the universe has a particular will. There's something that the universe is trying to do. There's something I'm trying to do with my life. Can I align these? Can I align these things? Or what are the practices that would allow me to see value clearly enough to know that as I act, I'm falling into the stream of the Tao, the living, the display of living value. Right. I talk also about living value, meaning not some dead idea of value, but the actual lived experience of it. So anthro-ontology becomes key. We'll talk about that later, which is that it's also we're ultimately not giving a set of beliefs. We're ultimately giving some injunctions, which have to do with the opening of the eye of value. And therefore, this way in which there's not so much a God's eye view as much as there is the ability to live on the inside of God's face, or your face and the inside of God's face are the same, which isn't a view from nowhere. It's a view from you. It's precisely your view, but with God's eyes, right? In which case, the uniqueness of value, it's worth noting. It's like, we're so far past relativism, we're into unique value, meaning like there is something intrinsically, irreplaceably unique about your value. And to your point about relationality, about the value of your surround, meaning like, yes, that tree is infinitely valuable intrinsically, no matter what, but that's also the tree you've known for 20 years. You've known that tree for 20 years. There's a unique value between you and that tree that does not exist for any other tree or person. So our value, and that's new God. One way to think about the tradition that we're working in here, the Hebrew tradition, is that the goal of the mystic, the goal of the human, the goal of the one aligned with the will of God would be to create new God, create new value. The idea that there is more God to come, and that it is our responsibility, in a sense, to vindicate God, to make possible what we've always known. Another definition of God is just the possibility of possibility, just that there is change, that there is this living field of value that continues to express itself. So those are my reflections.
No, that's lovely. One last question on that front is, if there is this will and an unfolding in a direction, how do you relate? I'll put it this way. It sounds like a word like God, you relate mostly to the process, but what about the telos? Is there a sense in which the new God or whatever this realization of this potential that we can participate in, is how is God related to that? Is that do you understand that? Does that make sense?
The future of God, and the Omega, right? The kind of Teilhard de Chardin, kind of like God as the allurement of the future, God as the memory of the future. And I think a lot about the metaphor of temple, right? Like the temple is a physical structure. So it's like if we don't destroy the planet and we don't make the thing into a giant prison, then we could make it into a temple. That it's a job here to create sacred architectures where God could live among us, essentially.
I call that building the cathedral. But
yes, precisely. Yeah. And the cathedral, the temple, there's this ancient discourse. And of course it is the Hebrew wisdom discourse is about the temple and about how it's arranged, and where the Holy of Holies, the sanctimony, and the actual the actual presence of the living field of value and creating structures in which those can kind of like reside becomes a kind of very, very important type of project. And so that movement towards what are we moving towards? We're building a temple,
Yeah.
in honor and to invite God back into our lives, if I can say that. But I
Oh, no,
don't.
you're giving me evangelical flashbacks.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
here.
dude. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's weird when you slip into that because I'm not a thing, but the language kind of, and it's true in a way what I'm saying, but I don't mean it that way, you know.
Right,
But
right.
I do very much mean that you know, there's a there's a kind of sacred work to be done,
Yeah.
and that's humans have long believed themselves to be involved in some kind of sacred work, and you know, right now we're all so secular, we can't imagine what it would be like to have that kind of sacred calling and vocation. And but it would be such a gift to be able to create institutions and systems of ideas where young people could start to actually, you know, live with a real sense of sacred purpose.
Yeah.
That wasn't some crazy fundamentalist thing. That was actually, you know, postmodern sacred vocation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so essential for psychological health, I think.
Amen. This was really helpful for me, actually. You know, I feel
Awesome.
like yeah, clarified a lot of things, clarified my eye of value a bit. And no, it just I felt like I could, you know, sync up a bit more, you know, where I'm coming from and where this book is coming from, where you're coming from. And so I greatly appreciate that. So yeah, maybe we'll continue this at some point if you'd like to get into other aspects of this. But for now, Zak Stein, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Good luck with everything.
Thank
See you
you.
later.